I'd like to welcome you to Deep Dive. It's a monthly online webinar hosted by First Things First Okanagan, where we explore climate solutions for ourselves and our communities. I'm Sue Kirschman, and Lori Goldman is on the controls. Tonight, I'm coming to you from Nickel Plate Lake near Apex Mountain. I thought it would be appropriate to show one of our upland lakes that are an important part of the Okanagan watersheds. Our organization is fortunate to be located on the unceded traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. The Syilx strive to govern their land with principles embedded in traditional knowledge, stories, and ceremonies. Last week, an historic gathering of Syilx Nation chiefs, mayors, and regional district representatives signed a memorandum of agreement to protect water. And this is the first time that leaders from the Syilx Nation and local governments have come together to discuss an issue of common concern that reaches across jurisdictional boundaries and is too big for any one government to solve alone. So it's very exciting. This is a Syilx-led approach to co-governance rooted in values, protocols, and stewardship practices that have sustained Okanagan lands and waters since time immemorial. The Memorandum of Agreement process was facilitated by the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. And we hope that tonight's talk will help us to think about Syilx values and shared responsibility to care for our forests. With our world warming, forests, their watersheds, and the communities in the valleys below are at increased risk of floods, drought, and wildfires. Our guest speaker, Jennifer Houghton, will talk about how these risks are compounded by current forestry practices and how they could be mitigated through new forest management practices. Jennifer's home in Grand Forks was flooded in 2017 and 2018. After that, she became deeply involved in reforming forestry in BC. She co-founded the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society, along with a small group of locals who were concerned about the damage from industrial logging to the ecosystems in that region. As project manager for the Power of Forest project, Jennifer is traveling the province to present the new Forest Act proposal and collaborate with BC grassroots groups in a drive for forest management that prioritizes ecosystems and local communities rather than corporate profits. So while Jennifer's speaking, if you have any questions, you could just type them into the chat and we'll be having a moderated Q&A afterwards. Also, don't worry about copying links and resources from the chat. These will all be included in the follow-up email that we send to all registrants, as well as a video recording from tonight, which we encourage you to share with others. So I'll turn it over to you now, Jennifer, and thanks so much for taking the time to come and speak to us tonight.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'm going to share my screen. It's a great honor to be here. I really appreciate that you guys have invited me to, sorry, I can't talk and like do screen stuff at the same time. So I'll just get my screen shared and then I'll finish my thought there. Okay.
It looks good.
But I'm not on the right screen. Let me try this again. Sorry. I got to be on the right. Oh, there we go. Okay, how's that?
No, now we're seeing your
My notes.
Your notes. Yeah, it was good before.
We had it all set up in advance, and now that it's the moment of truth.
Go up to the top, start at the beginning.
You go to the presentation view.
How's that?
No, we don't see it yet.
Okay. And again. Okay.
Have you?
That's it. You got it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Anyway, so thank you so much for inviting me here. Sue and Lori were telling me about all the great things that you guys have been doing and how your people who are involved with your group are so engaged and you guys got great letter writing campaigns going. So, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about the Power of Forest project and our new Forest Act proposal. So we're calling for a new Forest Act in BC to protect communities and nature from the negative impacts of industrial forestry. So I'm going to start by telling you guys my why I got involved in this kind of thing. And everybody's got a why. You've all got a personal reason for doing what you do for the environment. And then I'm going to spit some facts. I'm going to talk about the rationale for the new Forest Act. And then I will tell you about the new Forest Act. I'll summarize it anyways. Just going to put my timer on so that I can keep an eye on the time here. All right. So our website is up on the screen. I'm going to bring it back again later. It's boundaryforest.org. So when I'm talking about the new Forest Act proposal in the backgrounder, you can find it on our website there, boundaryforest.org/our reports. Okay, so this is my why. This is where it started. I moved to Grand Forks in 2016 to start my life anew, and things were going really nicely. And then in spring of 2017, my house and about a dozen others got flooded. And that year I had about 1.5 feet of water in my house. And then in spring of 2018, the most catastrophic flood that BC has ever experienced, at least up until that point, hit Grand Forks. So 400 homes were hit, and most of the downtown businesses, along with farms and ranches in the area. And I thought I was prepared for that one, though, because I had built a 30-foot wall, or 30-foot, 3-foot wall of sandbags around my house when I knew the flood was coming. And I knew the flood was coming because I've been watching the river data and the snowpack data and comparing it to previous years. But then I ended up with over 4 feet of water in my home. So that's me in my house showing the CTV guy the water level. It had upturned my fridge and dumped over the shelves. And it had impacted neighbors in a big way. I looked around and I saw the shock and devastation on the faces of my friends and my neighbors, and I wanted to find out why it happened. There were people who had 8 or 9 feet of water in their homes, and people whose homes had to be destroyed because the water damage was so extensive. Someone referred me to forest ecologist Herb Hammond, and he showed me an aerial Google photo of the Kettle River watershed, which is an 8,000 square kilometer mountainous, sparsely populated area of mostly crown land. And he pointed to the gray blobs on the photo and he said, those are all clear cuts. And I knew. So over the next few years, I got together with other concerned locals, including retired loggers, and we formed the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society. We chose the longest name we could think of. And we formed to address the negative impacts of forestry in our region. I also traveled around the province because I wanted to get a broader perspective and get a better understanding of the issues. And I listened to scientists and foresters and politicians and residents. And I learned that there are hundreds of grassroots groups like ours trying to protect our communities and nature from the negative impacts of industrial forestry. There are a lot of dedicated folks out there volunteering to make things better for forests and for their communities. And then, of course, since 2018, the disasters in British Columbia have multiplied, and the cumulative and immediate damage from industrial forestry continues. Decades of overcutting from industrial logging have resulted in enormous losses of primary forests in BC. Between 2001 and 2019, logging accounted for almost 4 million hectares of forest cover loss in the province. And when that's compared with the most forested nations on a per capita basis, BC's record of total forest cover loss is by far the worst. So the red on this map from Conservation North are the areas of BC that have been disturbed by human activity. So that means that there's no primary forest left there. The green is what's left of primary forests. It's pretty dismal. In addition to monetary costs, industrial forestry has taken its toll on people, wildlife, and ecosystems. The damage has been examined, studied, photographed, and published by hundreds, possibly thousands, scientists, journalists, and residents. So in our backgrounder document, which is available on our website, we go into some of the costs. The costs and the damage could fill 1,000 page volumes. I'm just going to mention a few here. So let's start with peachland. In 2019, the journalist Ben Parfit wrote this article about how clear-cut logging is driving a water crisis in BC's interior. And he wrote, community watersheds across the province were once off limits to logging, but in recent decades, that's all changed. Now, communities like Peachland face escalating costs as mudslides trigger boil water advisories and the need for pricey water treatment plants. So some of you who are in Peachland know better than me how murky your water has been and how unsafe it has been to drink for long periods of time. So the new water treatment plant was built at a cost of $25 million. And since then, upgrades have been needed. The last numbers I saw was around $3 million. And it's because the sediment is coming, it's not coming in consistent doses. So it's hard to keep the water treatment plant functioning properly because of the inconsistencies. So this is a map of the cumulative logging activities in Peachland's watersheds, and that has degraded the quality of drinking water. So this is a quote from the article. The forests behind Peachland have been extensively logged, the land mined, cattle grazed, and crisscrossed with roads. Clear-cut logging in particular has accelerated in recent years with serious downstream consequences. Multiple use of watersheds is resulting in multiple abuse of water resources, with the communities in harm's way left to foot the bill. And again, it used to be that community watersheds were off limits to logging. The province used to set apart reserves for special uses, such as protecting water. By the early 1970s, almost 300 watershed reserves were formally designated in BC, and it was the Ministry of the Environment that was in charge of those reserves and community watersheds. But despite such protections, logging has been occurring in many watersheds, including upstream of Peachland. So in essence, it's the Ministry of Forests that has effectively taken control over community watershed lands. So I don't know if it's really obvious from this diagram, but many of the clear cuts were, or future ones will be, at high elevations. And that's where the heavy snowpacks accumulate due to the lack of trees. And that's precisely the same conditions that we in Grand Forks believe contributed to the flooding that we experience. High elevation logging. It takes a really, really, really long time for trees to grow back at those high elevations. And predictions now, because of climate change, are that it's doubtful that many of those forests will ever grow back. In 2014, BC's Forest Practices Board released an investigation of forest practices in community watersheds. And the board found that between 2006 and 2014, logging occurred in 131 community watersheds. And they found that the accelerated logging was a result of the provincial government encouraging companies to aggressively clear away forests that had been attacked by mountain pine beetles. I'm going to come back to the topic of mountain pine beetles a little later, and I'm going to talk about why and how salvage logging is bad, despite what industry and government is saying. Okay, so hydrology is the topic. In our tour in September and October, the Power of Forests hosted a talk by Dr. Yunus Alila, and he's a leading expert in forest hydrology at UBC. And in this talk, he dives deep into the complex factors behind the 2024 Houghton landslide. He says, forget the oversimplified story of heavy rains as the culprit. The real causes are cumulative disturbances, especially in forestry practices. So the science that Dr. Alila and his graduate students are undertaking, he challenges conventional thinking, and he says that conventional hydrology is misguiding forestry practices. He calls it voodoo hydrology. He says it's a hydrology of convenience and that it's indefensible. And so it does not, the conventional BC forest hydrology does not reveal how forest disturbances affect the frequency of extremes, like flooding, like landslides and drought. And Alila argues that cumulative disturbances from industrial forestry are raising the groundwater table elevation, which makes landslides more likely. And a key element in his argument is that forest disturbance and loss of forest cover are raising the groundwater table elevation, and this leads to landslides because it destabilizes the soil over time. Now, his analysis is a direct challenge to the outdated and flawed science that is currently guiding forestry practices in BC. So our YouTube channel has that video up right now. Our YouTube channel is at Boundary Forest. So you can find Dr. Yunus Alila's full presentation. It's just over an hour, and he'll go into more detail. So over the past 10 years in BC, there's been an increase in floods, fires, and drought. In 2021, BC had those 3 extreme weather disasters, the heat dome, wildfires, and an atmospheric river and flooding. Gee whiz, it's happening again. And a study found that the cost to BC's economy from these events are estimated to be between 10 and 17 billion. And in 2023, I probably don't have to tell a lot of you who are on the call today, wildfires in the Shuswap and Okanagan caused more than $720 million in insured losses, making it BC's costliest event ever. And the BC wildfire budget has doubled. It used to be 1 billion, and then it went up to 2 billion. There has been a massive increase in fires in all areas of BC except Vancouver Island over the past 10 years. And the rise in the southern interior of BC is particularly shocking. So on this graph on the far right, you see the rise in the fires from 2014 to 2023. So this graph came from David Broadland. He's an analyst and a journalist, and his website is evergreenalliance.ca. So we can share that with you in the resources. He's got tons of analysis like this and great graphs so that people can get a picture of what's really going on. Now, the BC government likes to blame global climate change for the increase in all of these problems. However, it's convenient for them to do that because they can throw up their hands and they can say, well, we can't control what's happening across the planet. But this increase in the frequency and magnitude of these disasters and extreme weather events can be directly and indirectly linked to industrial logging. The science has been done. And again, probably thousands of pages and thousands of volumes. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the science in this presentation. But what we're getting from this is ecological devastation. We're getting degradation of water, soil, of the hydrology. We're getting a loss of biodiversity, local extinction of species. And Canada's greenhouse gas emissions from logging are higher than those from oil sands. That's a little known fact. And we've got the citations for that in our backgrounder document if you're interested in looking up the details. And then we've got the loss of climate moderation that's offered to us by primary forests, which function very differently than tree plantations. The tree plantations that have replaced some, but not all, of the primary forests because They're required to replant, but sometimes the replanting doesn't take. Tree plantations function very differently from primary forests, and they are actually contributing to the problems that I've just described. So all of this from a system that's not bringing returns to the people of BC. What we've got is we've got more than 80 sawmills at this time have been shut down since 2000. Over 55,000 jobs have been lost. And industrial forestry is only contributing 1.9% of the jobs and less than 2% of the GDP. Plus, you may have already seen this analysis by David Broadland. He crunched the numbers, and it's costing BC taxpayers $365 million a year to support industrial forestry in BC. So he balanced out the expenses, the revenues, the subsidies, and all the other costs that are going into forestry. $1 million a day. And the root of these problems is provincial legislation, which is protecting private interests. So when I traveled and I talked to people across the province, I noticed that that's where the gap is. There's a lot of people in their communities that are working on their local issues, and that's important stuff. And that sort of work has to be done. But nobody seemed to be working on changing the forestry legislation. That's the root of the problem for all of us. And nothing changes until the legislation changes. We know that unlogged primary forests have a moderating effect on climate, floods, and heat. We know that we need to conserve them and restore previously logged areas in order to ensure our very survival. So our laws have to conserve the power of forests and all of the things for which we value forests. The provincial government may not be able to control the global climate, but it can control logging on public land. And this requires a replacement of the current provincial legislation. What we've got now is legislation that's based on an outdated paradigm. The new Forest Act will be based on a new paradigm of ecological management. So I'm not going to go through every line on this chart. But what we've got on the industrial side is we've got a system that's focused on timber supply and profits. It's focused on private interests. The emphasis is large outside, quite often multinational corporations. It's about a high volume of production, raw logs, dimension lumber, fiber, and pellets. The decision-making is centralized. I already mentioned tree farms, and clear cutting is the logging method. They can call it other things, but it's always clear cutting because they're removing all of the parts and the pieces, and they're either destroying or interfering with nature's processes, with the forest processes. The new paradigm is an ecological one, and it's focused on nature's needs. The priority is ecological integrity and resilience. Its emphasis is the public interest rather than private. Small to medium-sized local businesses are emphasized. High value of products rather than volume. And then the decision-making is community-centered and decentralized. And on the ground, the focus is biodiverse species and conserving primary forests. I'll talk a little bit more about the logging in a minute. That industrial paradigm and corporate control are deeply woven into BC forestry legislation and policies, which are complex. So under the current provincial legislation, there are a lot of problems. Here are just some of them. Tenures held by corporations are protected. Professional reliance is written into policies and operations. And in our region, whenever we've gone to talk to local politicians about changing forestry practices, they make it very clear that they're just going to defer to professionals in forestry rather than even bothering to educate themselves about alternatives or ecosystems. They defer to professional foresters. Corporations are left to monitor themselves under the current system, and there are no significant negative consequences for companies that are degrading the land or eliminating local jobs. So tenure holders have no motivation to shift from an industrial paradigm to an ecological paradigm that would benefit both nature and communities. And if you're the CEO of a forestry corporation, you're not going to go to your shareholders meeting this year and say, you know what, I think this year we're going to focus on peachland's water quality and we're going to protect bear dens instead of worrying about profits. It's just not going to happen. They're not motivated. And we're not going to get anywhere by chipping away at the forestry legislation one policy at a time. It's just too deeply ingrained. So it's time for a strategic shift, a complete restructuring, through a new Forest Act. And here's what we're recommending. The tenure system will be eliminated. It's going to make us unpopular in some quarters. There will be no buyback of tenures from companies. Again, that's going to make us unpopular too. They have been sufficiently compensated over the years with enormous profits and subsidies from taxpayers. The people of BC do not owe them anything anymore. So let's look at how to transition. The current Forest Act has to be repealed, and that means that all licenses must be dissolved. And there is a mechanism within the current Forest Act to do that at the 5-year renewal time of every license. And depending on the term of each license, the transition period would be from 1 to 5 years. And this would give the forest industry and communities time to transition and adjust. Not that forestry corporations give people time to adjust when they shut down a mill and 300 jobs are lost. But our plan would also provide the government with the mechanism for an orderly shift, both economically and administratively. There are a lot of acts that need to be repealed. I'm not going to go through them. This is just a few of them. There's about 20 of them. We do recommend holding on to the Water Sustainability Act and fully implementing it. It's a powerful piece of legislation that was never enacted, and it would fully support this new Forest Act. Now, the new Forest Act will be a complex piece of legislation. It'll be written by government lawyers and legislative experts who should work on behalf of the BC public and Indigenous peoples. So we've identified 3 key priorities that must be the basis of the new legislation. And the intention is that the principles, standards, and structures delivered in our proposal rounder will be augmented and developed by public servants using the right legal language and legislative mechanisms. So the new Forest Act that we're proposing is founded in principles to provide a system that, under priority 1, preserves and restores natural ecosystem integrity and resilience. Under priority 2, gives Indigenous people and BC residents a say in what happens in the forest ecosystems that affect them. And under priority 3, builds stable community economies that support local communities and the larger BC economy. Okay, so I'm going to go through the priorities in a little more detail. There's a lot more detail in the documents that we've created. But first, I want to make clear that we're still working on these documents. They're being refined and fleshed out more, and they're going to be expanded as we go along with the project. So the first priority is ecosystem integrity, and that's it's an overarching priority, and we must enshrine in law that all forest management decisions, now you'll see on the screen that it says all forestry decisions, but we probably are going to change the wording of that. So it says that all forest management decisions are based on ecosystem and conservation science, plus Indigenous knowledge, rather than timber supply considerations. There's a reason there's an umbrella on the screen, and that's that the preservation of ecosystem integrity is an umbrella priority that applies to everything that comes after it. The top goals for this priority are to safeguard people from hazards like floods, fires, and drought, and climate change by preserving nature's capacities for protection and mitigation, and to enable nature to continue to provide the ecosystem services and benefits that humans need for survival. Now, we're recommending that nature-directed stewardship is the foundation for the new Forest Act. This is just a name. It's a type of ecological management that goes by different names, including ecosystem-based conservation planning. Forest ecologist Herb Hammond has written extensively on this subject, and there are others as well, and there are examples of these types of plans already being implemented successfully. So as part of our plan, it's important that we specify what kinds of activities can take place and where. And so here's the 3-zone forest management framework that we're recommending. Zone 1 is primary forest, and it's a conservation zone. So there's no logging or other extractive human activities to be done there. We do recommend that traditional practices, indigenous traditional practices and ecocultural practices be encouraged in these lands. Zone 2 is the restoration forest. And so that's a zone for the ecological restoration of forests that were previously logged, so secondary forests. Now, extensive levels of restoration are going to be needed over extended time periods because nature doesn't operate on the rotations that forestry does, 40 years or 90 years or whatever it is. Nature operates on 500-year time frames and 1,000-year time frames. So the restoration is going to be extensive and it's going to take a long time. The restoration forests will include a lot of different areas, but I wanted to emphasize that they have to include watersheds with cumulative risks to water supplies, so that'd be peatland, fish habitat, human habitation, and hydrogeological function, that'd be Houghton. It must also include lands necessary to act as corridors between the islands of primary forests that are left, so that those areas can be improved for wildlife cover, for safe movement, migration, and gene flow. Zone 3 is the forestry zone. It's where logging can take place. And we're recommending that it be partial cutting rather than clear cutting. And there's a lot of definitions of partial cutting. As long as it's done according to the principles of nature-directed stewardship, that's what we're looking for. And in Zone 3, even though that's where the logging is going to happen, ecological limits to logging still have to be identified and acted upon. So I wanted to come back to the salvage logging issue. It's sometimes called post-disturbance logging, and that's what happens after insects, disease, or fire. And in our proposal, it will not be practiced in Zone 1 or Zone 2. So when I was talking about the Peachland watershed, you probably remember the reason that the government was allowing so much logging in community watersheds is they were saying it was to deal with pine beetle. But if you look at this quote on the screen on the red there, it says, fire and pest outbreaks are not reduced by salvage logging. They are made worse by salvage logging. And that goes against what industry and government are saying. That's a quote from Dr. Dominic de la Sala, who's a fire ecologist. And you can find that whole presentation about salvage logging on YouTube. The video is called Gaming the Ecosystem, and it was put out by Conservation North. And it's well worth a watch because there's so much propaganda out there now about salvage logging being good for communities and for the ecosystems, and it is not. Okay, so that ecological priority is the umbrella priority, and no matter what else is being discussed, it must dominate the outcomes. So let's move on to priority 2, which is community-centered decision-making. And that is a recentering of forestry decision-making that provides for the public and Indigenous people to share in decision-making at all levels of planning and management. Indigenous peoples will participate in decisions through being a part of the government agency that oversees the administration of the new Forest Act. Now, here's the structure that we've created for the administration, and I'm not going to go into it now. It's pretty complicated, and but it's centered around community forest boards, which are comprised of local people and Indigenous people, and they'll be supported in doing forest management under the principles of nature-directed stewardship. They'll be supported by science panels, Indigenous knowledge panels, regional log sort yards, and a reinstatement of forest rangers. So that's the big green box on the left there, the community forest boards. Now, nature-directed stewardship recognizes that successful human economies are dependent on thriving natural ecosystems. And so that brings us to the third priority, which is to develop community-based economies, which are stable, diverse, ecologically sustainable, and the government has to eliminate corporate monopolies and instead use all that money that's being used for subsidies to the forest industry to support small to medium-sized businesses doing one, local forestry, conservation, and restoration work that follows a nature-directed stewardship approach, and two, the non-forestry nature-based industries. Just to let you guys know, I'm going to go over by about 2 minutes, but we're coming to the end here. So protecting and conserving forests will open up opportunities for developing and expanding these other industries. And those include nature-based tourism, subsistence economies, non-timber forest products like mushrooms and medicinals, and Indigenous guardians programs. So when it's preserved, BC can offer a wealth of world-class natural landscapes and unique biodiversity that provide communities with sources of ecological, sociocultural, and economic value that have nothing to do with extracting timber. But even the forestry done differently can still supply jobs, more jobs than forestry is supplying now, even if we reduce the amount of volume that comes. That's coming out of the forest. The Harriet Proctor Community Forest, which is based in Nelson or near Nelson, does their work based on ecological forest management principles, and they have a value-added mill, and they're creating 6 to 7 times the number of jobs that standard forestry is creating in BC. Okay, so it's a lovely vision. It is the right thing to do at this point in time. It's the right political decision for BC to take on behalf of citizens and Indigenous people to take back control of public lands from private companies. And we need to do that for the sake of the future. So how do we get there? Well, again, nothing changes until the legislation changes. So here's what we're asking you to help us with. People across BC have to start pushing for the same thing. Right now, there are thousands of people asking for forestry problems in their local regions to be fixed, or they're pushing for one specific thing like saving old growth, and those are important. But without a change to legislation, it's really hard for anybody to get very far. So we're asking you to start by reading the new Forest Act. And you can download it off of our website, boundaryforest.org/our reports. So we're asking that you read it. It's about 25 pages. The backgrounder is about 25 pages. If you're a science nerd, you might want to read that. And once you read it, write down the 3 things in that proposal that resonate for you the most, because whatever resonates for you the most is the thing that you're going to be able to talk about best when you talk to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and you go to talk to politicians. The second thing that we're asking you to do is to subscribe to our newsletter, which is at boundaryforest.org. And the reason for that is because we're creating a 2-page policy brief. It will be out in a few weeks. And what you can do is you can print off that 2-page policy brief. It'll have a link to the Forest Act proposal, and you can take that to meet in person with your MLA and your local political representatives. And you can ask them to read the policy brief, ask them to download and read the Forest Act proposal. And on the back, you can handwrite your why. And that's what's going to stick in the minds of politicians. You get lots of people coming to them asking for things. Handwrite your why and connect it to the things that resonated with you in the Forest Act proposal. Okay, thank you. That was a lot. My aim was to introduce you to the new Forest Act and inspire you to join our campaign by spreading the word, by doing grassroots lobbying with your politicians, by donating, or by volunteering. And we're developing a strategy over the next few months as we continue to meet and unite. Okay, so let's open it up for questions now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really wonderful and shocking and hopeful at the same time. Judy asked, do you have any hope for the BEHF being implemented? BEHF.
So that the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework. So, I mean, it's it has no legal teeth. It's just kind of wishful pie in the sky thinking. And it sounds lovely. And if it was implemented via policy and legislation, that would be what we're looking for. But the government has given no indication. There's no timeline. There's no description of how they're going to implement it in law. It's just a document. It's a toothless paper tiger at this point. So would we like to see it implemented via legislation and policy? Sure, that would mean that we could do other work. But yeah, I don't see the government making any moves to implement it.
Okay, and Tracy asked, do you have any Indigenous lawyers involved in this?
We don't, but we'd love to. Bring them on.
Yeah.
We sent out like about 100 invitations to Indigenous groups to join. We haven't had any takers yet, but we're just getting started here. And so hopefully once we get the momentum going, we can draw some Indigenous peoples as well as Indigenous lawyers directly into what we're doing. It would be great to have a lawyer on our team. So if you know anybody, send them our way.
Well, maybe with this memorandum of agreement about the waters in the valley here, more traction will be created. Lisa says so much could be achieved by using the available tools in the Forest Act and the Forest and Range Practices Act. You do not necessarily need new legislation. It's all about the political will. What do you think about that?
Well, the advisors that I've been listening to for the past, like since 2018, are people who've been in this arena for a very long time, like Herb Hammond. He's a forest ecologist, but he was also a professional forester. Other professional foresters, people who've been working for the Ministry of Forests. They've had careers in the Ministry of Forests who are now retired. There was a gentleman named Ray Travers. He passed away a few years ago. He was a very knowledgeable, wise man. He worked for the Ministry of Forests for his entire career. Anthony Britniff as well. He's someone who used to work with the Ministry of Forests. So those are just some of the advisors, and they're all of the opinion that we need to start over. It's just such a complex weave. And for all of those reasons that I described, it would be hard to extricate corporate control, professional reliance. There's just too much. And so far, none of these advisors have said to me, well, there's this mechanism or that mechanism. You know, these are people who are registered or retired registered professional foresters who are saying, no, we need to scrap it and start over. And so Anthony Britniff wrote an article, I think it was published in the National Observer, where he described his experience in 2003. He was sitting in his office in the Ministry of Forests, and down the hall from him, industry lawyers were drafting the new legislation, the Forest and Range Practices Act. So then that was unheard of, that industry lawyers were drafting legislation. And so it's just so deeply intertwined. Nobody has given me, like, people keep saying that, well, there's mechanisms, but so far no one has described exactly how that would work and what it would look like on the land. We need to start over, and we need to have a new paradigm. There has to be a new model for how we treat ecosystems. And that's just not in the existing legislation. There has to be a basis, a standard and a principle that describes the vision for forest management. And that's not in the current legislation.
Yes, that makes it very, very difficult because, as Scott says, it's really hard to overcome the vested interest in the forest industry and the intransigence of the government. I mean, it's really hard to do that without just rewriting the Forest Act. Philip also asked, what is a realistic timeline for new forestry regulations to be introduced? I mean, we'd like it yesterday. But...
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. All I can say is we're just going to keep going one step at a time. We're going to devise a strategy. So right now our strategy is, um, so we just did a tour and talks like this. What's happening is we were getting people who are already what you call greenies support of this. So we've got lots of support from people who already understand and are aware of the issues because they've been involved in environmental issues for a long time. And our next step is to expand outside the bubble of environmentally active people and to share and share this with and educate what you could call ordinary people, and maybe even some people that you might think wouldn't support this, and maybe people who might be sort of to the right politically, people who are forestry workers. We need to go there and show them the benefits of doing this. And it's not just save old growth, which is important, but there's economic benefits and there's job benefits and there's community benefits. And so the strategy is to expand, to get ordinary people understanding what we're doing, to get politicians to understand what we're doing. So we're going to take it one step at a time. And you never know what would happen though, right? Like surprises come along the way. Maybe some politician will step up and say, I'd like to work with you and develop a bill and introduce it in the legislature. That could happen at any time. When we first started doing this tour in September, it was the very first event in Nanaimo. And this fellow named George Anderson, who was running as a political candidate for the NDP at that time, this was in September, I approached him and I said, hey, here's what we're doing. And he said, oh yeah, I've heard of you guys. And this was before our tour even started. He said, oh yeah, I heard you're touring the province with this new Forest Act proposal. So that was a surprise. So people in government are talking about this. And so that's good. It was really good to hear.
Lisa also asks, if this were totally implemented, how would that affect the housing costs, the costs of building houses, as so many of our homes are built from wood? This is often where we would get pushback, right? If we stop doing what we're doing, oh my gosh, it's going to be so expensive for us in our industries.
Well, that is a good question, and that's been asked before, and we're going to be doing some calculations on the economics of it. But I mean, a lot of, and we also have to look into how much wood is being used to create pellets and is being shipped to the UK. How much wood is being kept in British Columbia and is actually used to build houses in British Columbia. So we need to compare imports and exports, like how much of our stuff is being shipped as raw logs and never comes back here, either to BC or to Canada. So that is an important question, and we need to figure that out. And I just did a tour of BC, like I drove all over the province, and I'm sorry, pardon my French, but there's some fucking enormous houses out there that don't need to be that big. Like really, huge mansions are being built to house two people. And so things are just going to have to change all around. Otherwise, we're not going to have any forests which bring us rain, right? So anyways, we're doing those calculations, and hopefully we'll come up with an answer that makes sense to people in the next few months.
So probably we need to have some kind of a lobbying campaign where people all around the province meet with their MLAs and elected leaders and talk to them about this, and set up meetings to say that what we're doing is not working, and we really need a total shift on this to take our land back, to take our future back.
Absolutely.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions? I saw that
Catherine has her hand up.
Yes, Catherine, you have your hand up. You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, I just wanted to say the good news is that shortly before the election, the corporations pulled out. There was an article in the Globe and Mail, and they've clear-cutted most everything arbitrarily. So now they're pulling out to clear cut in the States. So I think there's an impetus for change. And I think such industries as hemp and, as you say, mushrooms are on the agenda. And the neoliberal policy that was talked about in the 1980s by UBC scientists was criticized as doing all the things you're talking about. But no one considered the necessity for a paradigm change because we just weren't ready. We had dug in with neoliberal policy and we weren't going to change. And Rustad, of course, is right on board with that. So we've had a great amount of pushback. And that's not going to stop in the legislature. But I'd say there's an impetus for change now because the corporations have pulled out, Forestry Corp. And that was one of the reasons the North was lost to the NDP because of the capital flight.
Yeah, a lot of mills, a number of mills have shut down in the past couple of years. Canfor, I think, shut down 3 or 4 mills up there in 2023. And what's been happening too, and we've got this chart in our backgrounder, David Broadland, again, he's the one who did the analysis, is the harvesting levels were fairly steady for about 20 years, but in the past few years, they've started to go down. And industry likes to say that's because government regulations have gotten tighter and blah, blah, blah. But that's not the case at all. What's happened is they went in and they overlogged. They got used to logging all this for pine beetle. And they've logged themselves out of jobs is what they've done. And now what's left is the more expensive wood, the more expensive timber to access. So they need to do helicopter logging and steep slope logging. And so, yeah, they are going to the States. They're investing in mills down there. And the rotations there are shorter. So it's very appealing. Like trees grow in 15 to 25 years versus whatever rotations they have here, 50 to 90 to 120-year rotations up here. And so, yeah, I think there may be hopefully less resistance from the forest industry as a whole. I think we've got a lot of resistance from the guys who are hanging on, probably hanging on even tighter these days, the ones that sell equipment and the ones that just invested in equipment, and they've got industry propaganda machines out there. They're still going strong. I still see that stuff going through my Facebook feed, industry propaganda. But yeah, I think what's happening is also going to make politicians take a second look and realize that something needs to be changed. And what we need to do is unite and push the change in this direction.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. A lot of great information. I look forward to reading the information on your website. We'll just make sure we have all the links on that from you so we can pop them into the email. I'll just make a couple of quick announcements before we wind up. First things first, we'll not be hosting a deep dive in December. Our next one will be in the new year. So check out our website or sign up for a monthly newsletter to find out what we'll be up to in 2025. And for those of you who live near Penticton, there's going to be a climate cafe next Tuesday, that's November 26th, at the Oasis Church on Skaha Lake Road, starting at 6:30. And this will be a great opportunity to meet people and chat about climate concerns and solutions and forestry, if you like. First things first, we'll be there with a lot of information, as well as sign-up sheets for our new book and movie club that will be starting in February. We'll have details about this event in the follow-up email too. I can't think of anything else. Laurie, do you have any other announcements that you know of?
No, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, except that we will be sending along the link to the deep dives that are on our YouTube channel, and please share them with everyone. Because we cover a lot. We've covered a lot in 35 sessions, and yeah, just share with people and let's mobilize in Penticton and all across the country. There is a Seniors for Climate are mobilizing and coming together. We are doing some here as well. And so, keep tuned for things that are happening to move the needle, to work together to lobby our elected leaders for better policy. Oh, if you're in Vancouver is voting next week. The city council is voting next week to maybe allow gas back in new buildings. So please check that out and make your voices heard that we want no gas in new buildings. That's it. Thank you, Sue.
Tracy, do you have a quick note? I see your hands up.
Super quick. Jennifer, if you could perhaps connect with First Things First Okanagan or even Okanagan Climate Hub, and I'll put that in the chat. If you get any meetings with any of the politicians, if you get any kind of a letter going where there's a, for groups and individuals to sign on, keep us in the loop on that, because maybe we can then follow up with emails to politicians that you meet that are sympathetic.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Yeah, I'd like to keep in touch with you guys and your groups, and also, encourage anyone who wants to keep up on this issue to subscribe to our newsletter. But this is part of our strategy, is to connect with other groups so that we can unite and be stronger.
Fantastic. Well, it seems a little bit early, but because we don't have a deep dive in December, I guess we can say Merry Christmas to everybody. So we hope to see you again in January, if not before.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Jennifer. Jennifer's in Ontario, so it's very late at night.